September 14, 1944. Kummersdorf Proving Grounds, 40 kilometers south of Berlin. Hauptmann Klaus Becker stood beside a machine that made no sense according to everything German armor doctrine taught. The M18 Hellcat tank destroyer sat in the morning sun, its long 76mm gun angled skyward, its armor so thin Becker could see light through the bullet holes. American infantry had punched through the hull before abandoning it near Aachen 3 weeks earlier. The vehicle had been transported to Kummersdorf under strict secrecy, one of several captured American armored vehicles brought to Germany's primary testing facility for evaluation. Becker, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had commanded Panzer IVs at Kursk and Panthers at Normandy, had been assigned to lead the testing program. His orders were explicit: determine the tactical capabilities and weaknesses of this American tank destroyer so German units could develop effective counter-tactics. What Becker discovered over the following 3 days would force him to write the most troubling report of his military career. A report that would be classified immediately upon reaching Berlin, a report that concluded with words no German armor officer wanted to admit: "This vehicle represents a tactical philosophy we cannot match with current doctrine or existing designs." The Hellcat weighed 18 tons. Becker's Panther weighed 45 tons. The Hellcat's armor ranged from 1/4 inch to 1 inch thick. The Panther's armor was 3 inches thick on the front glacis. By every measure German doctrine considered important, protection and firepower balanced against acceptable mobility, the Hellcat should have been inferior. It sacrificed everything for speed, mounting armor so light that German anti-tank rifles could penetrate it at close range. Yet as Becker reviewed American after-action reports captured along with the vehicle, he found something that didn't align with German assumptions. This supposedly vulnerable tank destroyer had an operational kill ratio exceeding 2 German tanks destroyed for every Hellcat lost. The Americans called it the Hellcat, a name painted on many vehicles alongside cartoon images of snarling cats wielding guns. The official designation was M18 GMC, gun motor carriage. Development had begun in 1942, when American armor doctrine was still recovering from the shock of German tactical superiority demonstrated in North Africa. The initial American response to German armor had been predictable: build heavier tanks with thicker armor and bigger guns. But the M18 represented a different philosophy entirely. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The design brief was radical by conventional standards: maximum speed, minimum weight, sufficient firepower to destroy any German tank, and armor thick enough only to stop shell fragments and small arms fire. The designers accepted that the M18 could not survive a direct hit from German tank guns. Instead of trying to withstand enemy fire, the Hellcat would avoid it entirely through speed and maneuverability. Strike fast, kill the target, disappear before the enemy could respond. German armor philosophy had evolved along entirely different lines. The experience of the Eastern Front, where vast distances and massive Soviet tank formations dominated, had convinced German designers that armor protection was paramount. The Panther, which entered service in 1943, embodied this philosophy. Heavy frontal armor sloped to maximize deflection, a powerful 75mm gun capable of destroying Soviet T-34 seconds at long range, and sufficient mechanical reliability to operate across the expansive Russian steppes. The Panther's top speed on roads was approximately 30 miles per hour, 25 miles per hour, cross-country under ideal conditions. This was considered acceptable because German doctrine emphasized defensive positions, prepared firing positions where Panthers could use their superior armor and firepower to destroy approaching enemy tanks. Mobility was important, but protection and killing power took priority. When Becker climbed into the Hellcat's driver position on the morning of September 15th, he immediately noticed differences. The interior was cramped but efficient. Controls were simple, almost crude by German standards. The transmission was automatic, requiring no clutch operation, something German tankers found bizarre. How could a driver properly control a tank without a manual transmission? But when Becker started the 9-cylinder radial engine and engaged the transmission, understanding began to dawn. The Hellcat accelerated like nothing he had driven before. From stationary to 30 miles per hour took less than 30 seconds. The vehicle handled like a racing car, responsive to steering inputs, stable despite the speed. Becker pushed the accelerator further, 40 miles per hour, 45. The Proving Grounds main road stretched ahead, 2 miles of straight pavement normally used for speed trials, 50 miles per hour. The Hellcat was still accelerating. At 55 miles per hour, Becker eased off the throttle, not because the vehicle had reached its limit, but because he had. The sensation was unlike any armoured vehicle he had commanded. Panthers felt powerful but ponderous, requiring deliberate inputs and patient manoeuvring. The Hellcat felt alive, agile, almost reckless. Becker brought the vehicle to a stop and sat for a moment, considering what he had just experienced. A fully armed tank destroyer capable of 55 miles per hour on roads, 40 miles per hour cross-country, according to captured American performance specifications. The implications were profound. Oberleutnant Werner Schultz, Becker's second-in-command, and Aleyade Deposend Calls, veteran of the Panzer Lehr Division, took his turn driving the Hellcat that afternoon. His reaction was recorded in Becker's notes. "It is less a tank destroyer than a mechanized ambush. One cannot fight this vehicle the way we fight enemy armor. It refuses to engage on our terms. By the time we acquire it as a target and train our guns, it has already fired and repositioned. Our tactical doctrine has no effective counter." The testing program expanded over the following days. Becker's team conducted mobility trials across varied terrain, comparing the Hellcat's performance against captured Soviet T-34 seconds, against German Panzer IVs, and most importantly, against a Panther that served as the baseline for German armor capabilities. The results were documented meticulously, photographed extensively, and analyzed with growing unease. On soft ground, where Panthers often struggled with their weight, the Hellcat maintained speed and maneuverability. In forests, where German tanks had to navigate carefully between trees, the Hellcat slipped through gaps that would have stopped heavier vehicles. On roads, the speed differential was even more pronounced. A Panther travelling at top speed covered 30 miles per hour, the Hellcat covered 55. Over a 10-mile advance, the Hellcat arrived 11 minutes earlier. In tactical terms, those 11 minutes represented the difference between setting up an ambush or driving into one. Gunnery trials revealed another advantage. The Hellcat's turret, mounted on an open-topped hull to save weight, traversed a complete 360 degrees in under 20 seconds. The Panther's turret required 35 seconds for a complete rotation. When engaging targets that appeared unexpectedly from the flank or rear, the Hellcat could acquire and fire significantly faster. The 76mm gun, while less powerful than the Panther's 75mm, was adequate to penetrate German armor at combat ranges. American armor-piercing ammunition, which Becker tested against a captured Panther hull, punched through side armor with ease and could penetrate frontal armor at ranges under 1,000 meters. The Hellcat was not designed to engage Panthers from the front at long range. It was designed to get to the flanks, where armor was thinner, and kill quickly before German tanks could respond. September 18, 1944, Becker compiled his preliminary findings into a report that landed on the desk of General Major Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Armored Troops. The report's conclusions were stark. The M18 represents a fundamental challenge to our armor doctrine. We have prioritized protection and firepower, accepting reduced mobility as necessary compromise. The Americans have inverted this equation. They accept vulnerability in exchange for speed that makes vulnerability less relevant. Our Panthers cannot catch them. Our defensive positions cannot hold them if they choose to avoid engagement. Our counter-tactics assume enemy armor will advance to meet us. The Hellcat refuses this assumption. Guderian's response, documented in his memoirs published after the war, reflected frustration rather than dismissal. The Americans have the industrial capacity to experiment with radical designs because they can afford failures. We must perfect each design because resources allow few alternatives. That they have created an effective vehicle from principles we would reject is unfortunate but not surprising. American pragmatism often produces results that conventional military thinking would never attempt. The context of this evaluation requires understanding German armor development through 1944. Germany had entered the war with light and medium tanks, Panzer IS, IIs, IIs, and IVs, that were adequate against Polish and French opposition, but increasingly outclassed on the Eastern Front. The appearance of Soviet T-34 seconds and KV-1 second in 1941 shocked German tankers who discovered their guns could barely penetrate Soviet armor, while Soviet guns destroyed German tanks with ease. The German response was predictable. Design heavier tanks with better armor and bigger guns. The Tiger I, entering service in 1942, mounted an 88mm gun and frontal armor up to 4 inches thick. It could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, but it weighed 56 tons, traveled at 23 miles per hour maximum, consumed fuel prodigiously, and required constant maintenance. The Panther, introduced in 1943, attempted to balance protection, firepower, and mobility more effectively. At 45 tons, it was lighter than the Tiger while maintaining excellent armor protection through slope and thickness. Its 75mm gun could destroy most Allied tanks at combat ranges, but mechanical reliability remained problematic. Transmissions failed. Final drives broke. The Panther required skilled crews and extensive maintenance support to operate effectively. By September 1944, Germany was producing approximately 300 Panthers per month, a remarkable achievement given strategic bombing and resource shortages. But this production rate was insufficient to replace losses on both eastern and western fronts. Every Panther destroyed represented weeks of industrial capacity lost. Every experienced crew killed represented training investments that could not be replaced quickly. The attrition mathematics were brutal and unsustainable. The American approach to armor, as exemplified by the Hellcat, rejected German assumptions about protection being paramount. American designers accepted that modern anti-tank guns could penetrate any practical thickness of armor. The German 88mm gun could destroy even the heaviest Allied tanks. Soviet 85mm guns could penetrate American and German armor alike. The protection was impossible to achieve absolutely. Perhaps it made more sense to prioritize not being hit rather than surviving hits. This was the philosophy behind the Hellcat's design. Thin armor, reduced weight. Reduced weight enabled higher speed. Higher speed enabled tactical flexibility that heavy tanks could not match. The vehicle could advance rapidly to firing positions, engage targets of opportunity, and withdraw before enemy artillery or tank fire could respond. It was a hit-and-run vehicle, designed for a mobile, aggressive style of warfare that assumed American forces would generally be attacking rather than defending. German testing at Kummersdorf revealed that this philosophy worked, at least under conditions where the Hellcat's advantages could be exploited. In open terrain, where Panthers could engage at long range with superior optics and guns, the Hellcat was vulnerable. But in close terrain, forests, urban areas, anywhere that prevented long-range engagement, the Hellcat's speed and agility became dominant advantages. Becker's team conducted tactical simulations, positioning the Hellcat against Panther and Panzer IV crews, who were briefed to treat the exercise as combat. The results were troubling. In 12 simulated engagements, the Hellcat achieved first-shot capability in 9. German crews reported difficulty tracking the vehicle as it maneuvered. By the time they acquired the Hellcat in their sights, it had already fired and begun moving to a new position. One Panther commander, Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, described his frustration in terms that appeared in Becker's classified report. "We are hunting a ghost. I can see it, hear it, but cannot bring my gun to bear before it vanishes. Our advantage in armor and firepower is meaningless if we cannot force it to engage on our terms. This is not tank combat as we understand it. This is asymmetric warfare where our strengths become irrelevant." The psychological impact of facing vehicles like the Hellcat extended beyond tactical frustration. German armor crews in France and Belgium reported encountering American tank destroyers that appeared suddenly, fired with devastating effect, and disappeared before German forces could coordinate responses. The speed differential meant that American armor could choose when and where to engage, refusing battle when conditions were unfavorable, striking when German forces were vulnerable or unprepared. This was a fundamental inversion of the tactical relationship German doctrine assumed. German training emphasized that heavier, better protected tanks with superior guns would dominate the battlefield by forcing enemy armor to engage at long range, where German advantages in optics and firepower were decisive. German training emphasized that heavier, better protected tanks with superior guns would dominate the battlefield by forcing enemy armor to engage at long range, where German advantages in optics and firepower were decisive. But the Hellcat refused to play this game. It accepted that German tanks were superior in direct combat, so it avoided direct combat entirely. It used speed to dictate engagement terms, to appear where German armor was weak, to strike and vanish before retaliation was possible. This approach violated everything German tankers had learned about armored warfare. The concept of a tank destroyer that prioritized escape over survival seemed almost cowardly by German standards. Real tanks, German doctrine insisted, stood their ground and traded blows until one side was destroyed. The Hellcat's hit-and-run tactics felt dishonorable, unsporting, though Becker was professional enough to recognize that effectiveness mattered more than honor in warfare that had already abandoned most pretense of chivalry. The tactical reports from the Western Front, which Becker reviewed as part of his evaluation, painted a consistent picture. American tank destroyer battalions equipped with Hellcats operated with aggressive independence. They did not advance in formation with infantry. They did not defend fixed positions. Instead, they roved across the battlefield, exploiting gaps in German lines, ambushing supply columns, destroying artillery positions, and engaging German armor only when conditions favored American forces. One report from Panzer Division, dated August 1944 near Chambois during the Falaise pocket fighting, described an encounter that exemplified the Hellcat's tactical employment. A column of Panthers was moving through bocage country, the dense hedgerow terrain of Normandy that limited visibility and restricted maneuver. The column commander, a veteran of the Eastern Front, had positioned his tanks in standard formation, with lead vehicles watching for anti-tank positions, while the main body followed at intervals that prevented clustered targets. The first indication of American presence was the lead Panther exploding as a 76mm round penetrated its side armor. The shot had come from a gap in the hedgerow 300 meters to the right, an opening the Germans had not identified as a firing position. Before the column could respond, before the second Panther could traverse its turret toward the threat, the Hellcat had withdrawn behind the hedgerow and disappeared. The Germans deployed infantry to sweep the area, a process that took 15 minutes. By the time they confirmed the firing position was empty, a second Panther at the rear of the column was burning, hit from a completely different direction. The Hellcat had circled the German position using farm tracks that Panthers were too wide to navigate, engaged from the rear where armor was thinnest, and vanished again before German forces could coordinate a response. The engagement lasted 45 minutes. 2 more Panthers were destroyed, 1 damaged. The Hellcat was never hit, possibly never even acquired as a target by German gunners who were scanning sectors where they expected enemies to appear. This pattern repeated across the Western Front through the fall of 1944. Hellcats appeared in German rear areas, destroyed supply trucks and command vehicles, then escaped before German armor could arrive. They ambushed German tank formations from unexpected angles, killed 1 or 2 vehicles, and withdrew at speeds German tanks could not match. They operated at night, using their superior mobility to reposition between firing points, forcing German forces to defend everywhere simultaneously, because the Hellcat could strike anywhere. The psychological toll on German tankers was documented in letters and diaries that were later captured or recovered. Feldwebel Hans Kruger of the 2nd Panzer Division wrote to his wife in October 1944, "We are supposed to be the best tank soldiers in the world, but we cannot catch these American destroyers. They are everywhere and nowhere. We hear the gun, see the flash, and by the time we turn our turret, they are gone. It is like fighting the wind." I am more afraid of these fast Americans than I ever was of Soviet tanks. At least, the Russians stand and fight. Hauptmann Becker's final report, submitted to German High Command on September 23, 1944, included tactical recommendations that revealed how fundamentally the Hellcat challenged German doctrine. Conventional counter-tactics are ineffective. Our standard response to enemy armor, advanced to engage with superior firepower and protection, plays directly into the Hellcat's advantages. It wants us to advance because that exposes our flanks and forces us to concentrate on movement rather than observation. It wants us to pursue because our maximum speed is insufficient to catch it. Becker recommended instead a defensive approach that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war, when German armor dominated through aggressive maneuver. Units encountering Hellcats should establish static positions with overlapping fields of fire, forcing the Americans to approach prepared defenses rather than choosing their engagement positions. Infantry anti-tank teams must screen armor against close approaches. Air reconnaissance must be employed constantly to identify Hellcat positions before they can achieve surprise. Most critically, commanders must resist the temptation to pursue. The Hellcat's speed makes pursuit futile and leaves pursuing units vulnerable to additional ambush. These recommendations essentially conceded that German armor could not defeat the Hellcat through superior tactics or equipment. The best German tankers could hope for was to mitigate the Hellcat's advantages by refusing to fight on American terms, by adopting defensive postures that limited the speed and surprise that made the Hellcat effective. It was an admission that tactical initiative had shifted to American forces, that German armor was now reacting rather than acting. The broader context made this shift even more significant. By fall 1944, German armored forces were stretched across three major fronts: the collapsing Eastern Front, where Soviet armies were driving toward Germany itself, the Italian Front, where Allied forces were grinding through defensive lines, and the Western Front, where American and British armies were advancing toward the Rhine. German tank production, despite remarkable achievements given strategic circumstances, could not replace losses at the rate casualties accumulated. Every Panther destroyed by a Hellcat represented irreplaceable industrial capacity. Every experienced crew killed represented training that took months and could no longer be afforded given time and resource constraints. The attrition mathematics were brutal. Germany needed to preserve armored forces for decisive battles that might stabilize the front. Instead, those forces were being worn down in encounters with vehicles like the Hellcat that refused to engage in the decisive armor battles German doctrine expected. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. American production numbers made the comparison even more stark. The United States produced approximately 2,700 Hellcats between July 1943 and October 1944. Production cost was approximately $57,000 per vehicle, roughly one-third the cost of a Sherman tank. The Hellcat was cheap, fast to manufacture, and employed a common powertrain shared with other American vehicles, simplifying logistics and maintenance. If one was destroyed, 3 more were already rolling off assembly lines. German Panthers cost approximately 120,000 Reichsmarks, approximately $48,000 at official exchange rates, though such comparisons became meaningless given wartime currency distortions. But the real cost was measured in specialized components, skilled labor, and production time. Each Panther required components that could not be easily substituted or manufactured rapidly. Each one took weeks to build. Losses could not be replaced quickly even when industrial capacity was available. The fundamental asymmetry was that America could afford to lose Hellcats in tactically unsuccessful engagements because more were always available. Germany could not afford to lose Panthers even in tactically successful battles because replacements were uncertain. This industrial reality shaped tactical options in ways that no amount of crew skill or tactical brilliance could overcome. Becker understood this intellectually, though the emotional acceptance was more difficult. He had commanded Panthers at Kursk in July 1943, the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front, where German armor had faced Soviet defenses in depth and suffered unsustainable casualties despite achieving local, tactical victories. He had seen what industrial capacity meant when the enemy could absorb losses that would cripple German formations. Now he was seeing the same pattern on the Western Front, where American industrial capacity fielded vehicles that German industry could not match in numbers, even when German designs were technically superior. The testing program at Kummersdorf continued through October 1944, though Becker was reassigned to command a Panther company in the defense of Germany before the final reports were completed. His replacement, Major Otto Fischer, conducted additional trials focusing on potential vulnerabilities in the Hellcat design. Fischer's team discovered that the open-topped turret, while reducing weight, made crews vulnerable to artillery airbursts and infantry fire from elevated positions. The thin armor could be penetrated by heavy machine guns at close range. The vehicle's speed was only effective on roads or firm ground. In mud or snow, the Hellcat's ground pressure disadvantage compared to tracked vehicles became apparent. These were real vulnerabilities that German forces could potentially exploit. But exploiting them required creating battlefield conditions that forced Hellcats into disadvantageous positions, and the Americans had shown consistent skill at refusing battle when conditions were unfavorable. Fischer's report concluded, "The Hellcat's weaknesses are theoretical rather than practical. In actual combat, American crews avoid situations where these vulnerabilities become relevant. They use speed and tactical flexibility to operate only under conditions that favor their vehicle's strengths." The German army attempted to develop doctrine to counter the Hellcat threat through the winter of 1944 and 45. Training manuals were updated to emphasize anti-ambush tactics, constant movement to prevent American reconnaissance from establishing Hellcat firing positions, and immediate infantry deployment when Hellcats were encountered to exploit their vulnerability to close-range fire. But these counter-tactics required resources Germany no longer possessed in adequate quantities. Infantry units that could screen armor were increasingly committed to holding defensive lines against Soviet advances in the east. Fuel shortages limited the constant movement that might prevent American ambushes. Air reconnaissance that could spot Hellcat positions was impossible when the Luftwaffe had been swept from the skies by overwhelming Allied air power. The counter-tactics were sound in theory, but unexecutable in practice given Germany's deteriorating strategic situation. By December 1944, when Germany launched the Ardennes offensive that became known as the Battle of the Bulge, the Hellcat's impact was evident in American defensive responses. Tank destroyer battalions equipped with Hellcats were positioned to respond rapidly to German breakthrough attempts. Their speed allowed them to redeploy faster than German armor could exploit gaps in American lines. At Street, Vith, Hellcats from the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion engaged advancing German armor from ambush positions, destroyed multiple vehicles, and withdrew before German forces could bring superior numbers to bear. The engagement pattern that German testing at Kummersdorf had identified, the Hellcat's refusal to engage in sustained combat and its preference for hit-and-run tactics, was exactly what American crews executed in actual battle. German tankers found themselves fighting an enemy that would not stand and die, that chose speed over honor, that prioritized mission effectiveness over the romantic notion of armored duels that German tactical culture still valued despite years of brutal warfare that had stripped away most illusions. Oberleutnant Werner Schulz, Becker's former second-in-command who had driven the captured Hellcat at Kummersdorf, encountered American tank destroyers during the Ardennes fighting. His Panther company was advancing through the Belgian forest near Bastogne, when Hellcats, from positions they had bypassed, engaged the German column from behind. Schulz later described the engagement in a post-war interview conducted by American historians in 1952. "We thought we had cleared the area. Our reconnaissance reported no enemy armor, but the Hellcats had let us pass, then hit our supply column following behind. By the time we reversed course to engage them, they were gone. We found 3 trucks burning, ammunition exploding, our supplies destroyed. The Hellcats had vanished. We searched for an hour and found nothing. It was exactly what we had predicted at Kummersdorf. Speed made them untouchable. Our Panthers were powerful but blind. The Americans were everywhere we were not. The psychological impact Schultz described was widespread among German armoured forces in the war's final months. The sense of tactical helplessness, of facing an enemy that could not be brought to battle on favourable terms, corroded morale in ways that direct combat did not. German tankers had proven repeatedly that they could match Allied armour in direct engagements, that their training and equipment were competitive when battles occurred under conditions German doctrine preferred. But the Americans increasingly refused those conditions. They used speed and tactical flexibility to operate in ways German armour could not counter, to impose a style of warfare that rendered German advantages in protection and firepower less relevant. It was asymmetric warfare, though that term would not be widely used until decades later. The Hellcat, with its radical emphasis on mobility over protection, represented a different philosophy of armoured combat, one that accepted vulnerability as the price of speed, that chose first strike capability over survivability, that prioritized operational tempo over tactical security. This philosophy was uniquely American in important ways. It reflected industrial confidence, the knowledge that losses could be replaced. It reflected strategic optimism, the belief that offensive action was preferable to defensive caution. It reflected cultural pragmatism, the willingness to abandon conventional wisdom if unconventional approaches produced better results. German military culture, shaped by centuries of European warfare traditions and decades of professional military development, found this American approach almost incomprehensible. How could a serious military accept armor so thin it could be penetrated by machine guns? How could crews be expected to operate vehicles where survival depended on not being hit rather than withstanding hits? The questions revealed fundamental differences in how the two nations understood warfare, risk, and the value of individual soldiers' lives. Germany, fighting for survival by late 1944, had adopted an attritional mindset where every soldier and every vehicle was expected to extract maximum cost from the enemy before being destroyed. America, fighting a war of industrial mobilization with confidence in ultimate victory, could afford to prioritize crew survival and vehicle preservation, could design systems that emphasized avoiding casualties rather than accepting them as inevitable. The Hellcat embodied this difference. It was designed assuming that if crews were skilled and the vehicle was fast enough, they could fight entire campaigns without being hit. This assumption proved largely correct. Hellcat loss rates in the European theatre were significantly lower than equivalent German tank destroyer losses, despite the Hellcat's minimal armour protection. The reason was simple. Vehicles that moved at 55 miles per hour and chose their engagement positions were harder to hit than vehicles that moved at 30 miles per hour and fought from static positions. Post-war analysis by the United States Army Armour School at Fort Knox examined Hellcat combat performance across the European campaign. The final report, published in 1948, documented that Hellcats achieved an overall kill ratio of approximately 2.4 German tanks destroyed for each Hellcat lost in combat. This ratio was superior to Sherman tanks, superior to most Allied armour, and comparable to German kill ratios despite the Hellcat's fraction of the armour protection German vehicles possessed. The report attributed this success to three factors: superior tactical mobility, allowing engagement, position selection, adequate firepower to penetrate German armour at combat ranges, and crew training that emphasized exploitation of the vehicle's speed advantages. The Hellcat had proven that in modern armoured warfare, mobility could be more valuable than protection, that avoiding enemy fire was more effective than absorbing it. For German armour doctrine, this represented a fundamental challenge that Germany lacked time and resources to address. The obvious response would have been developing German vehicles with comparable speed and similar tactical employment. But by late 1944, Germany lacked the industrial capacity for radical design changes. Existing production lines were committed to Panthers, Tigers, and assault guns. Retooling for new designs would have interrupted production at precisely the moment when any production was critical. German industry was instead focused on simplified designs that could be manufactured quickly with limited resources, vehicles like the Jagdpanzer 38 Hetzer that emphasized firepower and minimal cost rather than innovation. The Hetzer was effective within its limitations, but it represented incrementalism rather than the revolutionary thinking that had produced the Hellcat. Germany was trapped by earlier success. The Panther and Tiger had been answers to specific problems, Soviet T-34 seconds and KV-1 second, that outclassed German armor in 1941 and 42. Those designs had been successful, creating vehicles that could dominate Soviet armor in direct combat, but they had locked German industry into production patterns that were difficult to change even when strategic circumstances shifted and new threats emerged. The Hellcat represented a different path, one that assumed industrial capacity for experimentation, one that accepted that some designs would fail, but that rapid iteration would eventually produce effective vehicles. America had fielded multiple tank destroyer designs through the war, some successful, others less so, continuously refining based on combat experience. This iterative approach required industrial capacity that Germany simply did not possess by 1944, May 8, 1945. The war in Europe ended with Germany's unconditional surrender. Among the thousands of German officers who became prisoners of war was Hauptmann Klaus Becker, captured by American forces in Bavaria after his Panther company was surrounded and ran out of fuel during the final days of fighting. Becker spent 2 years in Allied prisoner of war camps, first in France, then in Britain, before being repatriated to Germany in 1947. During his captivity, he was interviewed multiple times by Allied intelligence officers interested in German tactical assessments of American equipment. In one interview, conducted in December 1945, Becker was asked specifically about the Hellcat testing at Kummersdorf. His response was recorded in the official transcript. The Hellcat proved that our doctrine was obsolete. We had designed tanks for the war we expected, one where armor and firepower would be decisive. The Americans designed tanks for the war they intended to fight, one where speed and industrial capacity would dominate. They were correct. We were wrong. By the time we understood this, we lacked resources to adapt. The interviewer pressed Becker on whether better German tactics could have countered the Hellcat effectively. Becker's response revealed the depth of Germany's strategic dilemma by war's end. Better tactics require resources we did not have. To counter the Hellcat, we needed constant air reconnaissance to locate them. We needed infantry to screen our armor. We needed fuel to maintain mobility that prevented ambush. We had none of these in adequate supply. The Hellcat exploited our weakness, which was not tactical inferiority but strategic exhaustion. Even our best tanks, our best crews, could not overcome that fundamental disadvantage. Post-war, the Hellcat's influence on armored vehicle design was significant. The concept of highly mobile tank destroyers influenced Cold War American armor doctrine, leading to vehicles like the M56 Scorpion, and eventually to the modern doctrine of mobile anti-tank systems that prioritize speed and firepower over protection. The Soviet Union, which received detailed reports on Hellcat performance through intelligence channels and captured German analysis, incorporated similar thinking into post-war designs that emphasized mobility and gunpowder for tank destroyers while maintaining heavy armor for main battle tanks. Germany, in its post-war rearmament as West Germany during the Cold War, adopted armor doctrine that blended traditional German emphasis on protection with recognition that mobility had become increasingly important. The Leopard 1 tank, which entered service in 1965, represented a compromise. Adequate armor for protection against contemporary threats, excellent mobility for tactical flexibility, and powerful armament. It was not a Hellcat, but it incorporated lessons that vehicles like the Hellcat had taught about the value of speed in modern armored warfare. In 1978, a symposium on World War II armor was held at the United States Army Armor Center at Fort Knox. Among the attendees was Werner Schulz, the former Oberleutnant who had driven the captured Hellcat at Kummersdorf, and later fought against American armor in the Ardennes. Now a retired Bundeswehr officer and armor instructor, Schulz was invited to speak about German perspectives on American armor design. His remarks, preserved in the symposium proceedings, reflected decades of reflection on lessons learned. The Hellcat represented a truth we did not want to accept, that in modern warfare, The side with industrial capacity to field adequate equipment in overwhelming numbers will defeat the side with superior equipment in inadequate numbers. We Germans prided ourselves on technical excellence, on building the best tanks in the world. But the Americans understood that 50 adequate tanks defeat 10 excellent tanks. The Hellcat was not the best tank destroyer by technical specifications, but it was good enough, and there were thousands of them. That combination proved decisive. Today, at the German Tank Museum in Münster, an M18 Hellcat sits in the American armor section, restored to operational condition. A placard beside it explains the vehicle's specifications and combat record. But the placard does not mention Kummersdorf, does not describe German testing of a captured Hellcat, does not quote Hauptmann Becker's classified report that concluded German doctrine had no effective counter to American speed and tactical flexibility. That story exists in archives, in classified documents that were declassified decades after the war, in the memories of veterans who tested or fought against these vehicles. The story of the Hellcat is ultimately about more than one vehicle's technical specifications or combat record. It is about the collision between different philosophies of warfare, between industrial approaches and traditional military thinking, between accepting vulnerability as the price of speed and insisting that protection must be paramount. The Germans who tested the captured Hellcat at Kummersdorf in September 1944 understood immediately that they were seeing something that challenged fundamental assumptions. A tank destroyer that could reach 55 miles per hour, that could appear anywhere on the battlefield, that refused to fight on German terms. Their reports, classified and buried in archives until decades after the war, revealed a painful truth. German tactical excellence, German engineering superiority, German crew skill, all the advantages that had dominated European battlefields for years, were insufficient against an enemy that combined adequate equipment with overwhelming industrial capacity and tactical doctrine designed to exploit mobility over protection. The Hellcat made Panthers look slow, not because Panthers were poorly designed, but because speed had become more valuable than armor in a war where American forces could choose when and where to engage. The German tankers who wrote those reports understood the implications even as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion. They had tested the future and found themselves belonging to the past, masters of a doctrine that industrial warfare had rendered obsolete. The Hellcat, light and fast and lethal, represented a new way of armored combat, one where survival depended on not being where the enemy expected, where victory came from speed and surprise rather than frontal assault and superior protection. For German tankers raised in traditions of armored duels and tactical brilliance, this was a difficult truth, but it was truth nonetheless, proven in testing grounds and battlefields, documented in classified reports and combat records, remembered by veterans who had fought against vehicles that moved too fast to catch and hit too hard to ignore. The principle that speed could substitute for armor, that mobility could overcome protection, that industrial capacity could defeat technical excellence, these became fundamental to post-war armor development across all nations. The Hellcat had proven them in combat. The Germans who tested it had confirmed them in analysis. The future of armored warfare belonged to vehicles that moved fast and hit hard, accepting vulnerability as the price of lethality. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.